Okay, great. So then let's get started. I think it's time already. In the previous rounds, you already learned about the fully or densely connected neural network that consists of fully or densely connected layers. And you already done some classification problem and regression problem, right? And if you remember, the main feature of fully connected layer is that each neuron in the input is connected to each neuron in the hidden layer. And there are quite a lot of connections. And what we did for the classification task, we had some 2D tensor, the image with the height and width and grayscale. So, and what we did, we just flattened this input in 1D tensor and fed this as an input to the network. So, and if you think about the scalability of this kind of network, so for example, we have like 100 by 100 pixel image. It's not a high resolution image, it's still low resolution image. And then we have, for example, 100 neurons in the hidden layer. Then you already have about 1 million of connections parameters. So these kind of networks are not really scalable, and it's difficult to train them when they are really deep. And then you need a lot of memory, and you need to do a lot of computations for this kind of network. Another things why we want to use a different architecture than the fully connected network is that if you think about the data type like the images, the features are sort of, they are structured, they are not in the random order. The feature have, let's call it some neighborhood of the like a neighboring pixels, and this neighborhood, they are forming specific kind of elements on the image. So we might, we would like to kind of use the network that would actually use this information, use this inherent structure of the image for the learning the pattern, instead of just flattening this image into 1D tensor. So that's the main ideas for using the convolutional neural network and or CNNs. And CNNs are really good for the analyzing or for working with the images. Before going to the architecture of CNNs, I'd like to give you some like a brief historical context of why and when they appeared. You may already know that in 1950s, 1960s, the field of artificial intelligence been developing already for quite some time, and there have been some networks built already, like fully connected feed-forward networks. And at the same time, there was a breakthrough in field of neurobiology, and specifically in the field of neural basis of visual perception. Two researchers, Hubel and Wiesel, in 1960s, they performed a series of experiments. And what basically they did is they inserted the electrodes in visual cortex of a cat. So the electrode is a device that records neural activity of brain cells or neurons. And then they presented different visual stimulus to the cat. It was simple stimulus like lines or like spots or patterns, or a complex stimulus, for example, nature scenery. And they've been trying to understand on what kind of visual stimulus these neurons are reacting, what is activating them. And they found that in the visual cortex, there are a population of cells that are very specifically reacting on lines. And there were population that been reacting on vertical lines. There were population reacting on only on horizontal lines, or in some specific degree of rotation of these lines. For example, in this illustration, we can see example of a neuron that reacting on this line with a specific degree of rotation. So these experiments and many others result in formulation of the model of visual perception. And I'll try to explain sort of a simplified general idea of this model. And the idea is that in the visual pathway, starting from the retina, from the eye, there is a receptors in the retina, and then these retinal cells, retinal neurons, they are encoding information, and then they send this information upstream to a more sort of advanced complex brain regions. And the idea was that there are so-called simple cells and there are complex cells. For example, simple cells could be these retinal ganglia cells. They are in the retina. Well, basically they are in the eye, so they are outside of the brain. And each of these retinal ganglion cells, they had specific receptive field. And what is the receptive field? It means that each of these retinal ganglion cells, they've been connected to only a small patch in the retina. So there was a very specific connection between each neuron and a specific like a location on the visual space. For example, this like a hypothetical neuron would react only if the light will be placed here in this red circle with the plus sign. So it's activation area of this neuron. And if the light will be placed somewhere outside this region, in the blue region, then the activity of this neuron going to be inhibited. And if the light is going to be placed somewhere outside of these three circles, the activity of the neuron is not changed. It's not affecting it. And this like circle is called receptive field. So the neuron is connected to only this field, and the activity of the neurons changed only if something happens in this field. Otherwise, it's silent. And each of these neurons have their own receptive field, and it can be in different locations. They can overlap also. And then they send this encoded information about some elementary visual stimulus to upstream to more complex cells. And the hypothesis was that these complex cells can combine information from the simple cells and form more complex receptive field that could detect more complex features or visual patterns. And so basically there is two main ideas in this model that are important. Is the idea of receptive field or local connections. So the neurons are connected to only restricted space, like a patch on the retina. And then the idea of the hierarchical structure. So there are low level cells, like a simple cells, and they send the information that more complex cells combine and form more complex feature detectors. So these ideas in biology inspired researchers in deep learning. And this is one of the first neuronal networks that sort of accommodated these principles or implemented these biological principles. And it's called Neocognitron. It was described by Fukushima in '88. Here you can see the link to the paper if you want to check. So of course, it's not exactly the same CNNs that we use nowadays. But the main principle is already there. So now let's go back to the modern CNNs. And there are two main building blocks in the CNN. It's the convolutional layer and pooling layer. So we first start from the convolutional layer. The convolutional layer specifically addresses the problem of this preservation of spatial information on images, 2D or 3D tensor, if it's a color image, and reducing the number of parameters. And it's doing it by implementing convolution operation. So now we're gonna briefly go through the convolution operation for CNN in CNNs. So imagine that you have some input. In this case, it's let's say 3x3 image. And you also have another matrix, which is smaller than the input. And the values of this matrix are trainable or tunable weights. And this matrix is called kernel or filter. So what we do, we just take this kernel, we put it on sort of top of the input, and we compute a weighted sum with the corresponding values. For example, we multiply the first value of the input with the first value of the kernel. 0 by 1 plus -1 by 0, 20 plus 20 by 2 plus 5 by -1, and the result is 35. So this is a first value of our output map. This map is called feature map or also activation map. What we do then is we slide this kernel by one step or by one pixel, and we perform the same operation again. -1 by 1, 0 by 0, 5 by 2, and -1 by -1. And the sum is 10. Then we go back to the left and down by 1 pixel and do this operation weighted sum again. And then moving by 1 step to the right, and the final value of the feature map is -5. You can also note that the output after convolution operation is smaller than the input, so the convolution operation reduces the size. And it might be not really clear yet, but what's happening with this convolution between the input and kernel, it's very similar what happened in densely connected layers. We also have some input, and we also have some, well, we can call it hidden neurons. This is the first layer, and this is a second layer. And the neurons in the second layer, in the hidden layer, they are connected to the neurons in the input layer. But in contrast to the fully connected layer, these neurons are only connected to sort of a patch of the input, not to the all input, like in densely connected, but only to a small patch. And this patch is called receptive field of a neuron, with the analogy to this biological receptive field. Another thing to note here is that, for example, this neuron has the weights W1, 2, 3, 4, and then all the other neurons in the same convolutional layer, they will have the same weights. So all these neurons will have the same weights, and this is called shared parameters. So here we can see the example where we have a 3D tensor as an input. Let's say we have an image 3 by 3 by 3, where the last dimension is a number of channels. If it's a color image, we have red, green, blue. And then in this case, the kernel will also have the same depth as the input. Here you can see two kernels. One is a bit like brown and one is a pinkish one. And each kernel has a shape 2 by 2 by 3. So like a width 2, height 2, and depth 2. There is 3 channels. So how we perform convolution in this case, where we have many channels. So we perform convolution with the corresponding channels of the input and kernel. For example, we take this first channel of the input, the red one, and we take this first channel of the kernel, and we put this first channel on top of this red channel. And then we perform convolution as before. Then for the green one, we choose the kernel, which is the second one, and for the blue channel of the input, which is the third channel of the kernel. So then you'll get 3 maps, and each value in this map going to be a weighted sum. And what you do next is, again, summation, but across the depth. So you sum up all these channels, and you also add the bias term. So this will result in 2 by 2 by 1 activation map for each kernel. Then we usually apply some sort of nonlinearity, for example, ReLU, in the same way as in densely connected networks. And we combine all the activation maps from the kernels. So in this case, we will have 2 by 2 by 2 because we have 2 kernels.
Shamsi, can I ask something? I put in the chat, but you didn't see. So in the previous slide, you showed the channels of kernels with the same color, let's say dark brown, but are they equal filters?
So they have the
or
same,
they can be different.
They have the same dimensions, 2 by 2, but the weights can be different.
Okay, so the numbers in the matrix could be different for each channel.
The weights are similar in these squares in each channel. In each channel, the weights for each neuron is the same, but between the channels, the weights can be different.
So in the previous one, we were doing some calculation with the numbers. Yeah, so this one is weight here, are you saying?
Yes, 1, 0, 2, -1, they are tunable or learnable weights, the same weights.
And you think they are similar to each other? 1, 0, 2. So it is not like 100 or 1 million.
Oh, no. What I meant that when we move kernel from one location to another, right? The weights are same. The kernel is the same. For example, when we move this frame.
Okay, we are covering the whole input. I understand that with this kernel. So this is, let's say, first channel's kernel, this one.
This the same means that they are the same when we move the location on the input. That's
okay. Okay, and when we go to second channel kernel, the numbers on this square could be different.
Yes.
And again, it is gonna move on the second channel of input in this similar manner, but the numbers would be different. Okay.
Yeah, well, for example, you can see here, there is, if you don't really yet understand everything, it's fine.
I think I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So we also have, in the notebook, we have some different animations, illustrations, and some links to tutorials. So if you don't really grasp how this works yet, visually, it's fine.
Yeah, and maybe you can share the link of the notebook, because I looked for it, but I couldn't find round 3 or any other lecture.
Will be released today.
Okay.
Yeah. For example, here we have the animation, and we have some input with the 3 channels, red, green, and blue. And we have 1 kernel with also 3 corresponding channels. And as you can see here, the values are between the channels are different. So those are different. But when you move 1 kernel on the corresponding channel of the input, then the weights are same. And then you just sum up the weighted sums, add the bias, and that's going to be forming our final output. Also plus nonlinearity.
One question.
Yeah.
I put in the chat, but so which means that the channels are summed into the one data. So the concept of channel is lost once this is done.
Could you please repeat your question one more time?
So each channel is going to be summed into the single outcome.
So let me. So the process is, for example, you can imagine this is the process for one channel, right? And you get from convolution between one channel, for example, a red one with the one channel of the kernel, you get one feature map. And in the end, you have 3 maps for each channel, 3 maps, but you then sum it up in the depth dimension. For example, you sum this value with this value with this value, and you get the sum across the depth of the maps.
Okay, got it.
Is that what you're asking, or?
Yes, yeah, that I was wondering.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have a quiz question. Imagine that you have input 3 by 3 by 3, like an image 3 by 3, and 3 channels, red, green, and blue, and you have 2 kernels of size, each of size 2 by 2 by 3. So again, we have the depth of the kernel the same as the depth of the input. So what is the total number of parameters? Just give a second to. So the answer is 26. And how do we calculate it? So first we take the dimensions of the kernel height, kernel width, and current number of channels in the kernel, and we multiply them. And then we also add bias term. And this is going to be number of parameters per one kernel. And then we have to multiply by number of kernels that we have. In this case, we have 2 kernels, and we multiply by 2. In practice, you don't really need to compute anything by hand, because in the Keras TensorFlow, you always can print out the summary of the model with the number of parameters, but still it's nice to know how to do that. So the second part of the CNN is the pooling layer, and we're going to discuss only max pooling layer, because this is the kind of layer that is mostly used nowadays. There is different variations of the pooling layers, but I think this is the most important one. So the principle of the max pooling layer is very similar to the convolution layer. We also have input, and in this case, input going to be a feature map, because usually we do max pooling after the convolution. So we do max pooling on the feature or activation map. We also have some kind of, not a matrix, but let's imagine that we have some sort of frame of a certain size and shape. So in this case, we have a feature map of 3 by 3, and then this frame going to be of size 2 by 2. So we also put this kind of frame on the top of the feature map, and instead of performing any kind of multiplication or summation, we're gonna just select the maximum value. So in this square, the maximum value is 20. And then we move this frame again to the one step. So the frame gonna be here, and the maximum value here in this corner gonna be 5. Then we'll move down, and the maximum value in this corner gonna be 20. And finally, in this corner, maximum value is 10. So this is how max pooling operation happens. The purpose of using this operation is to reduce the number of parameters. This is one. And the second one is to introduce some degree of invariance. We will talk about the invariance a bit later. And I have here another question. It's a bit tricky one. So imagine that we have some feature map of size 3 by 3, and we perform max pooling operation with the frame or the pooling size of 2 by 2. So this is a frame. So how many parameters do we have here? it's a trick question. We don't have any parameters because we perform max out operation and there is no parameters there. As I said before, in max pooling operation, and like when you use max pooling layer and we use a convolution layer, the size is reducing. The output size is smaller than the input size. So if we stack a lot of convolution and max pooling layers, then we may end up with a very reduced output, and we want to reduce with each subsequent layer, we want to reduce the size, but in a acceptable range. So to prevent this reduction in size, we use padding, and the padding means basically that you add dummy values or zeros in the border of your input. For example, in this case, we have no padding, so the size is a 3 by 3 matrix. If we add one layer of padding, then we'll have the matrix size 5 by 5. And if we add 2 layers of padding, then we'll have even larger matrix of size 7 by 7. We also talked about moving this kernel in convolutional layer or frame in max pooling layer by one step or by one pixel. And this step is called stride. And in this case, we say that we use stride 1, but we also can move this kernel or frame by some value of the pixels. For example, in this case, we can move this kernel by 2 pixels. So in this case, we say that the stride is 2. And as you may imagine, the larger stride you use, the smaller the size of the output. And you can see it in these illustrations where we use the input of size 3 by 3. And we have padding set to 1. So we have 1 layer of padding. So the final size of the matrix 5 by 5 by 1. And if we have kernel of size 3 by 3 by 1, and we use stride 1, how do we estimate the output size? So we use this formula where the output size equals to the input size plus 2 multiplied by padding minus kernel size divided by stride plus 1. So let's compute what we get after that. If this illustration is correct or not. We have input size 3. Here we use square matrices everywhere, so we just need to, we can use just one number instead of computing the separately for width and height. So the input size is 3 by 3, so we put 3 plus 2 multiplied by padding equals 1. Here we have 1 padding, 1 layer of padding. And then we subtract kernel size, which is 3 by 3 in this case, and we divide by stride 1 and plus 1. So in the end, we get output size 3, and this is what we see in these illustrations. So if we increase stride, as in this example, so we move the frame by 2 pixels, then we have 3 plus 2 by 1 minus 3 divided by now stride equals 2, which result in a smaller output size 2. So we have 2 by 2 matrix. So you can control the output shape by choosing the padding and stride. And again, you're not gonna be calculating this manually. You can always see what is the output shape in this Keras TensorFlow summary, or you can print the model and see what are the shapes in each layer.
Can I ask another question? Here, the input size is 3, you said, but I don't understand. This input is, to me, it is 3 by 3. matrix. So does it always have to be a square one? Can't we
No.
have 5 times 10 times 1?
No,
for
it doesn't
example,
have to be square one. It's just easier to use square one for demonstration.
Okay, but then shouldn't we use 9 as input size? How come input size is 3 here?
Input size 3, so in the notebook, you will have a more specific formula for height and the width. But for example, here you can substitute the input size by input height.
Okay, so it is actually height.
Yeah, but because the height and width in this case the same, I just put the input size. But if you have, for example, not the square matrix, you need to compute this output height and output width separately. So in this case, it just means one of those dimensions, either height or width.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. There are two things that you need to note or know about the convolutional layer and why they are so popular for the in the computer vision field is when you stack convolutional layers together, the receptive field for the deeper neurons going larger and larger. And this is the implementation of this biological principle of hierarchy, where the input from these simple cells is combined and sent to the more complex cells. For example, here we can see some input, and we have convolutional layer 1 and convolutional layer 2. And then the neuron in the convolutional layer 1 is connected to the small patch in the input. And the neuron in the convolutional layer 2 connected to all this square, all the neurons on the layer, convolutional layer 1. So basically it means that these neurons in the, which is deeper in the network, it's basically connected to whole input indirectly, because it's connected to all of these neurons in the first layer. I hope it makes sense. So another notable and very interesting thing about the CNNs is when you combine the convolutional and max pooling layer, this results in invariance. So what does invariance means? Imagine that you have some kind of input, and there is some feature, some element in this image, in this case, like there is a, for example, dog. And we train CNN to detect this specific feature or specific like pattern. So if we take this feature or pattern and we just shift it to the left, to the right, to the up or down, then the CNN still will recognize and detect this pattern. And this is called translational invariance. We can also rotate this pattern or the specific element, and this will result in rotation invariance because CNN is still gonna recognize it. And the same for the scaling, the elements, the visual elements, and this is a scale invariance. Basically, it means that the network is not sensitive to some degree when we are transforming the input, which is of course a very useful feature. You don't need, for example, separately train the network to learn the visual pattern with some degree of rotation, because like inherently CNN can learn it, all these variations. So that was the first part. And if you have questions now about these basics of the CNN, you can ask. I'll just read the chat. Okay. If there's no question, I think I answered this question in chat. Then we can move on. Or there is one more question. Is there general guidance on how we choose stride and padding? There is no hard rules how to choose the stride and padding, but there are certain most commonly used values for stride and padding. And in the notebook, we I think we use padding 1, something like padding 1 and stride 1 or 2. But for the simple networks that we are building in this course, you don't really need to tune these hyperparameters. Maybe if you have some specific, very more complex task, then maybe you need to tweak a bit what is your desired. You also need to think about what is the kernel size. Do you want smaller kernel or do you want larger kernel? Because that's also matters. For now, we just use the most commonly very simple combinations of these hyperparameters. So you don't need to really spend time to tuning them. So now we're gonna check. Oh, sorry, there is one more question. Okay. So now we're gonna check how to implement the CNN with Keras TensorFlow. It's really simple. It's very similar to how you've already been building the neural networks. To add the convolutional layer, you use TF Keras layers conv2D. We use only conv2D because we use images, which are considered 2D tensors. Well, if the color, we also have some channels like red, green, blue. But there are also another convolutional layers in the TensorFlow. So for example, if you have some time series, which is 1D tensor, or you have video, which is have like time dimension also, then you can also find different kind of convolutional layers. So, but in our case, we're going to use only this conv2D layer. And this layer has some amount of arguments. The most important ones are number of filters, kernel size, stride, and you can see there is some default value, and usually we don't really change the default values for now. And there's also some options for padding, and you have two options. You have padding valid and padding same. So the valid means that you don't add any padding. And the same means that the output going to be of the same size as the input, and the value of the padding going to be computed internally under the hood. So you don't need to compute it by yourself. You just pass the parameter same. And basically, this is how we build the convolutional layer. We input the number of filters, the size of the filter. If it's square, we usually use square, like 3 by 3. Then you can just input one integer. Then the padding and then activation. And if this is a first layer in the network, then you also need to specify the input shape. If it's not a first layer, then you don't need to specify input shape. It's going to be computed under the hood. To define the max pooling layer, it's even easier. We have very few parameters. We use TF Keras layers max pool, also 2D, because we mainly use images. And we're gonna only specify in the notebook, we're gonna only specify the size of this frame, or this like pooling size. It has already some default value, 2 by 2. You also can change the stride and padding, but yeah, you can try to tune hyperparameters and see how it's affecting the network, but in our case, we use very simple network, and usually the tuning hyperparameters is not needed here. And how do we combine these convolutional and pooling layers? So basically, we create the sequential model in the same way as before. And then we have a convolutional block. And this block is usually consists of few convolutional layers stacked together, and also max pooling layer. So this is one convolution block. You can add several of them, for example, 2 or 3. And then you also need to add a classification head. So what you do in the classification head, you just flatten whatever you got after the convolution. And then you define some like 1 or 2 dense layers with the activations. And then you have your output layer for the classification. So this kind of CNNs that you will have in the notebook. And I have a bit of time, so I want to just introduce very briefly few architectures, because this is introductory course and we are gonna only cover very simple cases, but CNN is very popular building block for the modern networks, and there are a lot of architectures there. So I want to mention the most historically important networks. For example, this LeNet 5 is one of the earliest CNNs. It's invented by Jan LeCun in 98. And this was one of the first CNNs, very successful CNNs. And it's kind of, by modern standards, very simple. It has a convolutional layer, it has a pooling layer, then again, convolutional pooling, and a couple of fully connected layers. Here you can see like a demonstration of how it worked. It was used in practice actually to read checks and to recognize the handwritten and printed numbers. And here you can see how the researchers are testing this network. So here I just wanted to show these nice animations from the site that is devoted to this LeNet 5, and how this network handles different kind of input transformations. For example, here you can see that this number digit 4 is shifted, and the CNN still recognizes it very well. So this is like a predictions here. So this is the translation invariance. Then we have a rotation of the digit, and this is a rotational invariance. And this is a scale invariance, and I don't know, like a squeeze invariance. So already this very simple CNN is able to handle these transformations of the input, which is quite impressive. So another very famous and important architecture is AlexNet, which was built by Alex Krzyzewski in 2012. And you have the name of the paper here. The difference is that this network is already getting deeper. So with the time, there is a tendency that the networks are getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So here we have a couple of blocks: convolution layer, pooling layer, and normalization layer. Nowadays, this normalization layer is not used anymore. And then there's a stack of convolutional layer, pooling layer, and a couple of fully connected layers. And as I already said, the CNNs are getting deeper and deeper. So this is example of the GoogleNet, or it's also called Inception. And as you can see, it even doesn't fit on the slide because the model is just huge. It's very deep and it's like very big. This architecture is interesting because it has so-called inception model. And the idea behind this inception model that, as somebody asked, like, how do you choose this hyperparameters? And one of the most important hyperparameters is the kernel size. For example, for some tasks, the smaller kernel size will work better, and for some tasks, the larger kernel size will work better. So research has been trying to kind of combine it and see which one works better. And these guys just decided to combine all of them. So they, in the one block, they use all kind of kernels. They use 1x1 kernel, they use 3x3 kernel, they use 5x5 kernel, and 3x3 max pooling. So basically the idea is at least something from that should work, which is very interesting, and it was quite successful. It has like several variations of this base model. So you can also find like a brief description of different architectures in this blog post if you want. And then I also want to recommend this website, Paper with Code. I like it because it has this browse state-of-the-art section where different papers are sort of sorted or clustered by topic. For example, there is NLP, medical, some time series graphs. And then when you choose certain topic, then you have the most important papers here with the links to the paper and link to the code if the code available. So it's quite nice website if you want to learn more about the different architectures, more more advanced architectures. And in this course, we will only handle the problem of the image classification, but actually CNNs are used very widely in different kind of problems in the computer vision. It's also the object localization where you need to find this bounding box, and semantic segmentation and instance segmentation. So CNN is used very widely. And also CNNs are maybe used as a sort of a feature extractor for more complex, more advanced kind of networks. So it can be sort of a building block for other networks.